What's up guys, you're watching Li-Fi TCG. This is the last video in my triple header for this week. I just uploaded 2 more videos on Pauper and Modern, so you can check those out if you're interested as well. Anyway, this video is for Standard, from a PPTQ I just played, so this is basically the first week where Dominaria was legal. I know you guys maybe watched all my videos on Tezzeret from the last format, and you might think with Khan and the Antiquities War, maybe I'm playing improvised deck still, or some kind of artifact deck. And I think those cards, maybe they have some potential, but there's a bit more complicated, more different things to test there. And also I didn't really want to buy Khans if they didn't turn out to be good without testing them first. So instead, what I played was Drakehaven, and I played this deck in a few events in the previous format, so I missed top 8 by 1 round in one, and then I really crashed and burned in a few other events. So in this most recent PPTQ, the one with Dominaria legal, I missed top 8 by 1 round, and I think that with the Dominaria, the strategy becomes a lot stronger. So the idea with Drakehaven, which was a deck that was popular in the Unified Standard at the World Magic Cup last year, is that you are a control deck without any creatures. Real old school, just removal and counter spells, and you sort of grind them out. So what that meant was that you won game 1 a lot, because they would have to shock you. They couldn't gain any tempo by shocking your creatures. Their fatal pushes literally couldn't target anything except for a Drake. Neither could Vraska's Contempt, for example. So winning game 1s were really easy because they had so many dead cards in your deck, in their deck rather. But then in games 2 and 3, all those bad cards would get boarded out, and your opponents would just have infinite numbers of duress and negates and planeswalkers and all these things that were really hard to deal with, while you were still clunking around with your Drakehaven, and the rest of your deck to support Drakehaven is a little bit subpar. So I think maybe the deck just wasn't very good. But now we have a few new cards, and I think things are much better. So as I usually do, I will start with the lands, even though that's a little bit boring, but save the best for last. So 4 Irrigated Farmland and 4 Glacial Fortress. This is kind of obvious. You're a blue-white deck, you want to play all of the good dual lands, and of course Farmland having cycling is really good with the Drakehaven. You have 2 more lands that have cycling, just because this seems like a decent number. I got 1 Desert of the True and 1 Desert of the Mindful. The only desert synergy is Shefet Dunes, so I'll talk about that in a second. So it could be correct to cut these for Scattered Groves and Feeded Pools, just because it's more synergistic with Glacial Fortress. So that's probably correct actually. I should get onto that now. In the next event I'll probably make that switch, because you never really have to activate Shefet Dunes more than once in a game, and you just sacrifice itself, so there you go. But having 6 cycling lands feels like the right number. The Shefet Dunes, when I first tested this deck I thought it was really unnecessary, but you hardly ever have to pay life off this, so the opportunity cost is really low, and sometimes it lets you kill the opponent a turn earlier, which can be important if you're trying to win rounds late in time, or it doesn't come up very often that you need it, but sometimes it's good and the opportunity cost is very low, so you just play 1 and it's fine. The other non-basics, 1 Arch of Orazca. So I talked about this in my series of Tezzeret videos, where I said that this card was really amazing. And in this deck I think it's slightly worse. So the reason for that is you don't have the puzzle knots to get it the City's Blessing by turn 5 or 6. so it's worse in that sense. This deck has Search for Azcanta in it. You never have enough mana to activate both, and the ability of Azcanta is just better, so that's another reason why this is a bit worse. But it's still like a really valuable ability to have on a land, and again, like I said with this card, the opportunity cost of having it is pretty low, and the payoff if you get there is really good. So 1 Arch of Orazca, then 1 Field of Ruin. So this is just good and standard for dealing with like enemy Azcantas, and for example, Scavenger Grounds, the land that exiles all graveyards. That card's becoming pretty popular lately. And it does affect this deck more than you might think. So having a way to just snipe that when they tap out can be good as well. And also sometimes you just snipe your opponent's Field of Ruins to protect your Azcanta. So one thing that I would try to do is just cut another basic for a second one. Because if you're like, even if you are color screwed, right, you can just activate it off and find the basic that you need. So one more of this might be good. And then it's just like a pretty even split of 6 islands and 5 plains, because you have the other white source in the Shefet Dunes. So that's a total of 24 lands, which seems good. Even though you are like a hardcore control deck, because you have so many cyclers to enable your Drakehaven, your draws are always like really smooth. You don't hardly ever have to mulligan, and if you need to draw lands, you can just cycle more cards. So 24 lands is maybe like a bit low for a control deck in the traditional sense, but it works for this deck. So then onto the spells. So you need a bunch of cyclers to make your Drakehaven work, so we're playing 4 of all the best ones. So 4 Renewed Faith, 4 Censor, 4 Hieroglyphic Illumination, 4 Countervailing Winds, and 4 Cast Out. So these are just all the best cyclers. So Hieroglyphic Illumination, Censor, and Cast Out are close to playable even without the Drakehaven. Like, they're all just solid cards by themselves anyway. Countervailing Winds is a bit inefficient. Like, it's way more awkward compared to something like Disallow, for example, and that's like a legitimate drawback. But you do need like a certain density of cyclists to make the deck work. And there is like a payoff for Countervailing Winds compared to something like Disallow, right? This does come up and it is important, so we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, so these are all the cyclers. I'm not playing the Sphinx where you scry when you cycle. I don't think it's necessary. Like, I don't think you need more cyclers, and it just enables the opponent's removal if you ever do want to cast it. So you know, space in this deck is really tight. So yeah, so obviously all the cyclers are here to enable the Drakehaven, and then the other part of the cycling synergy is the Abandoned Sarcophagus. So this card is just ridiculous. So it doesn't do anything in multiples, and it also doesn't do anything until you have a lot of cyclers in your graveyard. So you only need 1. But in the late game, it's just really stupid. It's like permanent Yawgmoth's Will. You cycle your cards into the graveyard and then you just cast them. Like, even though it looks like a slow value card that would be bad in aggro matchups, for example, often you just like cast this and then you flash back a couple of Renewed Faiths and you gain a bunch of life, and then like you're like really far out of reach for losing the game. So yeah, this just feels really insanely strong when it works. But like I said, like this card and this card make you a little bit weak to Scavenger Grounds, and you have to be a little bit careful about that sometimes. Oop. Drop myself on the floor. So yeah, that's the cyclers. to the next thing. So the rest of the deck is sort of just like generic blue-white control cards. So 4 Settle the Wreckage, which is a really powerful sweeper, like the best white control card in standard right now, probably. And this is just a really fun card to use. Like, you hold up 4 mana and you put your poker face on, and then they have to figure out like, well, what's the best attack. And you know, every time they like play around it when you don't have it, you feel like a genius, and then sometimes you win those games and you feel like a super genius. It's just really strong and really fun. For me, it's one of the best parts of playing this deck. Yeah, I mean, there's not much to say about this card. Like, it's just playing wood sometimes. Answers anything, no questions asked. 4 mana, one-sided board wipe. Really good. And then the other removal is 2 Steal Away and 2 Fumigate. So some builds play more Fumigates, like 3 or 4 Fumigates main plus more Settle the Wreckage main. But you need like spot removal. When I say some builds, I mean like old builds that I saw when I was picking up the deck in the last format. It might have changed, if anybody's even still playing Drakehaven. So when you're leaning on these expensive removals, you just get blown out by Negate too badly. Or, you know, Duress or things like that. Or what's the other thing? Doomfall. So you gotta have some early removal. And the fact that this doesn't exile stuff, the Fumigate doesn't exile, means that it's bad against Hazoret and Scrap Heap's Grandeur. Yeah, so the Steal Away is really good. The awkward thing is that it can't hit Heart of Kirin, but you have enough other stuff to deal with that main deck and in the sideboard that it all works out fine anyway, I think. So yeah. Then 2 Search for Azcanta. So this deck can be really mana hungry in the late game, so it's nice that you have a thing that ramps you when it flips. It smooths out your draws. And like for a small investment early game, suddenly you're in a spot where you can end of turn gain some free advantage late game. So it helps you achieve that like late game, I'm a control deck, I'm winning situation, versus like fast decks without requiring too much of a commitment, and in a way that like helps you a bit in the early game. So this is a nice card. I mean, if you've played any standard, I mean, this is even played in Legacy and Modern. Like, that's how good it is. I probably don't need to convince you of it too much. But yeah, this card is good. 2 copies because it's legendary. You don't want to draw too many. But it's good enough that you want more than one. The one thing you have to be careful of, which is like a weird thing that I found with this deck, is that when you have Azcanta and this in play, the Sarcophagus, whenever you have a card with cycling that goes to the graveyard and you didn't cycle it, it gets exiled. So if you have a card with cycling on top of your deck and you have Sarcophagus in play and you mill it with Azcanta, it does get exiled. So think about that whenever you're deciding. Like, if you really don't want to draw the Renewed Faith, then maybe you just exile it anyway, but you've got to factor that into your decision when you have this combo, quote-unquote combo online. Your cycling cards won't go to the graveyard if you mill them. And then the last 2 slots is 2 Teferi. This guy is really good. So Ob Nixilis is like the closest comparison to this card, right? It's almost exactly the same thing. So one problem that this card solves for this deck is that it never had like an Ob Nixilis before. So you had to rely on your Drakehaven a lot. So like that was the only win condition that you had. So you had like removal. You had cards that were removal. You Settle, Fumigate, so forth. You had your counters. What you mean? They're kind of like removal basically. And then you had your card advantage cards. And then you had your win conditions, right? The Drakehaven. And all these things were separate. They're all separate categories. And they can all be like a bit situational by themselves, right? You might have a situation where Fumigate doesn't work out very well versus whatever your opponent's doing, or you might have a situation where you run out of gas and you can't find like a Hieroglyphic Illumination. You had this problem that like a lot of your cards were either like slightly underpowered or very narrow, and I think that was a big factor in why this deck wasn't that successful in the past. So you have this card now which does everything, right? Like it's card advantage, it's removal, and it's a win condition. So for example, in the previous format when I was playing this deck, I was playing all 4 copies of Drakehaven because I just thought that was necessary, right? Like you just didn't have enough ways to win the game otherwise. But now you have Teferi, which is like a very legit win condition. So it just makes the whole deck like overall a lot stronger. So the other good thing about this card, just some specific interactions, like it's really busted with this, right? Like if they have to be, your opponent has to be so careful whenever you pass the turn with 4 mana up, because if they Alpha Strike you and you Wreckage them, and then you Teferi on an empty board, like it just puts you so far ahead. So that's one thing. Compared to Obnixilis, right, the +1, it doesn't make you lose life, which is great, obviously, and the fact that it untaps 2 lands is also really nice. For example, you can cast a Drakehaven and then untap 2 lands. 2 mana is the amount of mana of a Steal Away, so that's a good interaction as well. You can cast Teferi and leave Settle the Wreckage back up for only having 7 mana, 7 lands, so that's also good. It can untap Azcanta, which is absurd. Like if you're at that point in the game, it's a little bit win more, but it's worth mentioning. You can main phase cycle something and then end of turn untap and still have all your mana available. It's deceptively strong, the untapping 2 lands. And then the -3, just answering any permanent, is great. And then the emblem is like a legit win condition. So imagine for a moment that all of your Drakehavens get extracted, right? Because Lost Legacy is the card in the format and people will bring that in versus you. So you do have other things in your sideboard, but Teferi can actually win the game by itself. So how that works is you get the emblem, you exile all your opponent's permanents, and then you tick it up, and then you just keep -3ing it to put it into your library, and then you can't ever deck out. So maybe that would like never ever come up. It seems like such a corner case, but it's just another example of like a powerful angle that this card gives you. Like it just does so much. Yeah, So, fantastic card. So I'm only playing 2, but you don't have to play too many copies of different things in this deck because you dig through your deck so quickly with all the cyclers. I don't think that a 3rd copy of Teferi would be necessary. So that's the whole main deck. Onto the sideboard now. We have the other 2 Fumigates. I don't know that these are 100% necessary, but I've seen a lot of people try to make Llanowar Elves plus Steel Leaf Champion work, and I just thought that this would be the best thing to do versus that. And in the few games that I played, that seems to be true. So I think you probably at least want 3 Fumigates in this 75, but maybe the 4th one is too many. Something to think about. 1 Lyra. So I don't want to play creatures main deck because part of the advantage of this deck is that your opponent's removal is dead. The fact that you have Teferi now means that you do have a target for Vraska's Contempt, so you do need to be a little bit careful about that. So that's worth mentioning, but like I said, Teferi is just too good, like it's worth it anyway. So this is just like a post-board, because you're a non-creature deck main deck, you'd expect that your opponent's boarding most of their removal out. And especially if they're like a mono-green Stompy deck, or like a mono-red Hazoret deck, they don't really have too many good ways to kill this anyway. So it's just Baneslayer at that point. Which is good, right? People know Baneslayer. So I only had 1 because it's legendary, so I thought maybe you don't need too many of it. And then it's like a relatively pricey mythic, and I didn't want to buy too many if it didn't turn out to be good. So 1 is fine. Maybe a 2nd one would be good too. Or maybe you actually want 0. Like I said, I just rushed this together. The format's only been out for a week, so we still need to figure these things out a bit. So I have the rest of the sideboard: 3 Negate, 3 Forsake the Worldly. So Negate is really good in control mirrors, obviously because it revolves around, the games tend to revolve around expensive non-creature spells, so Negate is like the most efficient answer. It's also fine against Heart of Kirin when you're on the play. That's the other main use for this card. And that matchup you probably don't want all 3, but you know, it's worth considering, especially because you don't typically think that you want Negate versus that kind of aggressive deck, but it's pretty solid. And then Forsake the Worldly is also good versus like aggressive artifact decks, vehicles or whatever, but it's also strong against control mirrors because Cast Out and Ixalan's Binding exist, and you need ways to kill those, especially when this is cheaper mana-wise. And then the cycling obviously is also cool in this deck because it helps you with the Drakehaven. You can replay it out of the graveyard with the Sarcophagus, and also in the situations where you don't need enchantment removal, like you can just cycle it. You know, cycling is a good ability. So not too upset with this, but it might be the case that 3 of each of these is too many. Maybe that you need to trim that somewhere. 1 Pull from Tomorrow. Just like a big bomb spell. So it's good against control decks because it's like a Sphinx's relation that if they don't counter it, you just draw a million cards. And it's also good versus some mid-range matchups because they can't counter it, right? So like, if your opponent plays Carnage Tyrant and your only out is a Fumigate, you know, you had to use a Fumigate to trade 1 for 1, so that wasn't very good. And then after that, your opponent played like a Galta, and you're like, oh no, I'm about to die to the skeleton, I better Settle the Wreckage that, and then you traded 1 for 1 again. So you end up in the situation in this matchup where, or these kind of matchups where your opponent can never have the wrong threat, but like you might not quite have the right answer. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're out of cards and it's just like, oh my god, am I going to find an answer for his thing? You don't want to be 1 for 1ing all the time. You do want a way to be like, bang, I just drew 5 cards and then I played a Teferi and now I have Settle the Wreckage in my hand and now you can't win. Like you do sometimes want something like that. But against control decks, you have other stuff like big bomb threats to bring in rather than this, and it really clunks up your hand in multiples, so you don't really want extra copies, I don't think. One cool thing that you can do in this deck is that you don't spend all your mana on it, like you leave 1 up and then when you discard a card you activate your Drakehaven. It's not always correct, obviously, sometimes you just want the extra card, but it's worth mentioning. Then Authority of the Consuls times 2. This is just like a good anti-aggressive card. So post-board aggressive decks attack you from 2 different angles. They have cheap value creatures that you can't profitably kill. So examples of those would be like Bomat Courier or PNLR, or sometimes things such as Scrap Heap Scrounger. Like you do have quite a lot of exile effects in the deck now, so that's not as big of a problem as it used to be. But you know, the cheap threats like this that are difficult to kill is one way that they attack you, and then the other way is they board out the cheap stuff that is easier to kill. Like if your opponent gets their, what's an example of like a random small dude, like a Toolcraft Exemplar swept up in a big Fumigate or something, that's not going to be a great situation for your opponent. So often they board some number of those cards out for like more Planeswalkers and stuff like that. So I think that with the negates and you have Drakehaven, you have Cast Out, like the bulky Planeswalker part of the deck, like you can reasonably deal with. What I found was that it was that early game stuff that was the problem. Like you want to get out of that first few turns at like a comfortable life total, so that you can start taking over the game with Settle the Wreckage and Teferi and stuff. You don't want your opponent to be able to be like, I'm just going to attack with my 1 guy, and if he doesn't have Settle the Wreckage, then it's going to kill him anyway. So he's forced to use Settle the Wreckage on my 1 dude, and then I have more guys to back it up, and now the blue-white players in like a dire situation. So instead, you want to have like some kind of card like Authority of the Consuls, so that when you get into that situation, if they're like, oh yeah, I'm just going to attack with 1 guy, then me with my Authority of the Consuls, because the clock was slowed because their dude came to play tapped and I also gained some life, I can just say, okay, fine, I take the damage. You know, you're not threatening me. Untap, Drakehaven, go. You know, something like that. And you know, now Drakehaven's online, so if they attack with 1 dude, you can just make a Drake and a chum block. So now they're forced to go wide and like play into your Settle the Wreckage and stuff. Like this is where you want to be. So you having a card that helps you get through that early game stage and not be pressured by Bomat Couriers and PNLRs and things like that is really important. So I think you probably want at least 1 more copy of this. Potentially all 4. Yeah, that's where I'm at on this card. It's really good. I think you want more. 1 Ixalan's Binding. just versus the control decks and so forth. Like you want another Oblivion Ring in addition to your cast outs. Two Ixalan's Binding on the sideboard is also fine. I played that for a while. Like over instead of the third Forsake the Worldly, maybe, like that's a pretty interchangeable switch you could make. Yep. Just work out how many Oblivion Rings you want or you can afford to play. But yeah, it's a good card. Especially against the decks that can't remove it easily. Like against mono red, like if you put a Hazard under this, like the fact that it blanks all of their best draws is just a really powerful effect. Yep, so you can play two of this. 3 is probably too many because it's 4 mana is a bit awkward, but it's a good card. And then the last 2 cards are 2 Nezahal Primal Tide. This is just such a fun card, like I really love it. I guess it sounds pretty stupid in like a competitive oriented deck discussion to talk about how fun your cards are, but it's really funny. Just, you know, you think you're both like some cerebral 200 IQ control geniuses, like, oh my god, he said he drew his card and he said go, and then I drew my card and he said go, and then he drew his card and he said go, and of course we both played lands throughout this time. So like I draw my card, I play my land and say go, and you're like, wow, how are we ever gonna break this terrifying stalemate? And then you're just like, bam, blue dinosaur, what are you gonna do? You can't counter it, and once you start trying to kill it, you find that you can't kill it, and now you're even further behind. It just absolutely breaks control mirrors like more than any other card. Like the weird thing is that sometimes it's not good at ending the game because it doesn't have evasion. Like if you sand this down and then your opponent immediately parks a Gonti in front of it, like that can be a situation that's quite difficult to deal with. But drawing a card whenever your opponent plays a spell means that even in that situation you should still be getting really far ahead. So yeah, so it's in control mirrors. It's just the biggest bomb, the most ephemeron-y, aetherling-y, morphling-y thing you could ever ask for, pretty much. And it even has like a special bonus wombo combo in this deck, because when you activate it and discard 3 cards, you get 3 Drakehaven triggers. So a lot of the time in the late game, your opponent might be like, okay, you have Nezahal, alright, I'm going to tap out for Teferi. And then you draw a card and you say, okay. And then in the second main phase, you activate this, and you get 3 more Drakes, or possibly 6 more Drakes, depending on how many Drake Havens you have. And then you untap, and then you activate Shefet Dunes, and you swing with them all, and suddenly you just like won the game out of nowhere. You know, it sounds like a win more situation, but one of the ways that you can ostensibly beat this card is by going wide around it, and the fact that it so efficiently gives you so many blockers when you have Drakehaven out with it, it actually comes up quite a lot, and it's definitely like a point to consider that makes this card better in this deck than it would in like a generic other blue control deck. So yeah, so that's the whole list. So one more thing, like even though this is a legend, and like I did say, like Lyra, did I call this Breya before? I don't know. Lyra is a legend, and that was part of the reason to only play 1. Like I'm very confident that I want this in matchups that come up a lot, and I want 2 because it's that good. Like this card is just so strong. So anyway, that's the Drakehaven deck. So from what I've heard through my looks at the results from leagues and people's discussions and whatnot, people are really onto it, or they seem to agree that Teferi is like the real deal, and people are trying different sorts of white decks. Like there's this Flash version with the Wrath guy, and maybe some History of Dominaria, and like that. And then there's another version which is just like a really generic blue-white control deck, and the win condition is basically Teferi or Gearhulk. So there's also that. So this doesn't really compare to the Flash version, like the doing things that are like a little bit too different, I think. But you can definitely try to compare this to that Gearhulk deck. So in the control mirror, like the card Drakehaven is probably an advantage. Because it's like a cheap threat that is relatively difficult to remove. You know, it comes down early and it builds into like a late game situation that is very hard to deal with and provides a lot of advantage. So this is exactly the kind of thing that you want for a control deck. But you still have the slight problem that in order to enable the Drakehaven, you have to be playing all of this sort of clunk, right? Like some of the, like in most situations you would rather this just be disallow, ignoring the synergy, right? Would most decks play 4 cast outs without the cycling synergy? Probably not. Would decks be even playing Renewed Faith at all? You know, all of these cards without the cycling synergy are just slightly not that good. Not too good, you know, compared to other things that you could be playing, and they're eating up slots of like other good cards that you could be playing. Like extra copies of Steal Away is probably something that I'd be really interested in using, but I don't know how I'm supposed to fit it into the deck. So in that sense, maybe that is what you're supposed to do. You're just meant to forget about the cycling, and just play Teferi and Gearhulk, and just say I'm going to win the game that way. So time will tell which of those is the best. My guess is that Drakehaven might turn out to be not the best, just because of my experiences with it in the previous format. Everything needs to come together, and sometimes it just doesn't. But at the same time, I think it might have the advantage in the mirror. So if blue-white becomes popular, that's something to consider. It's a little bit difficult for me to see how everything in the metagames are going to line up at this stage. But what I will say is that with Teferi now, this deck is way stronger than it used to be. And based on my experiences playing so far, I do think that it could be a really legit option going forward. So definitely keep your eyes out for the Drakehaven, or keep it in the back of your mind. Maybe test it yourself, see how it plays out. Because you know, Teferi is the real deal. So it seems likely that whatever blue-white shell turns out to be the best with Teferi is going to be a real contender in the format moving forward. So that's all I have to say about the Drakehaven this week. Like, subscribe, put all your comments and questions below. This is LifeITCG signing up.